Cancer Survivor Network, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. In this webinar, our panelists will companies and patient groups. We'll have experts from the innovative medicines industry, governance. Following the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions during an interactive Q&A session. And you just look in the little box on your webinar screen on the bottom right-hand side, and you will find the place to type your questions, and our panelists will endeavor to answer as many as we can. For those of you who haven't attended an earlier webinar, this webinar is hosted by the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, with patients, survivors, families, partner groups, and sponsors on collaborative action to identify and remove barriers to optional patient care, to ensure access to education and action opportunities, and survivor involvement in healthcare decision-making. We also support evidence-based research on ways to promote equal access to early diagnosis, timely treatment, and follow-up care. If you'd like to learn more about CCSN, you can visit us on our website, www.survivornet.ca. Right now, on our front page, you can read about National Cancer Survivor Day, which CCSN will support with Pause for the Cause coffee parties. If you'd like to host your own coffee party to help support, please email participate@survivornet.ca. You can get all that information on that page of our website. Our Oncology Roundtable on June 1st, where we'll gather together with many other cancer organizations to establish a collective vision and set of principles for a national pharma care strategy. If you'd like to get involved, head over to the front page of our website to find more and sign up. There are many other ways to get in, and also how to get involved right on our front page. One final note before we begin, this webinar will be available online tomorrow. There will be a full video on YouTube as well as slides, which will be on our SlideShare account. Links to both will be sent out tomorrow afternoon to everyone who's registered and will be posted on our front page. Now, over to you, Bill. We're having a little bit of technical detail. We're going to try and resolve a little bit of speaker issue. I can give you our message again if you're having speaker troubles on your computer. First of all, please follow these instructions. If you can see me but not hear me, check that your computer speaker is on. This is the speaker icon. Right-hand side of the bottom of your screen. Off looks like this. On looks like this. Click to turn your speaker on. Today we're welcoming a very distinguished panel for our webinar, and a lot of people coast to coast in Canada. We're still missing the north. And we're going to try again with our full sound in operation. So
okay, thank you, Mona. Hopefully the sound sounds better. If you have any issues with audio, please write in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner and let me know. Hopefully that's the end of our technical challenges. I'm just going to figure out how to share screen here, Matt. I don't know if you can set that up, and we'll get back into PowerPoint. And I was just going to talk about briefly my role with these webinars. The Cancer Survivor Network has hired me to help lead, present, or in many cases moderate panels like the one that we have today on issues of importance to the advocacy community or just the health system stakeholder community And we work with and help advocate for, and on behalf of, in some cases, a really broad spectrum of health sector stakeholders, ranging from health charities, the innovative pharmaceutical industry, healthcare professionals, academic health researchers, medical device companies, and the list goes on, just completely focused on the health and life sciences sectors. But for the purposes of the advocacy webinar series, we work with Jackie and Mona and the team here at the Survivor Network to really bring forward some interesting and important topics of interest, and one of the ones that we have seen come up with some regularity as patient organizations and others work with governments is the relationship between the private sector and patient organizations. So this is an excellent opportunity to talk about and to hear from different perspectives on how these organizations relate with each other, but still stay true to their own missions, visions, and values. And it's a subject of growing importance, I would suggest, for citizens and decision makers, in addition to those who are most impacted by health decisions, and especially, of course, patients. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes and then really pass it over to a very esteemed and sizable panel that we've got gathered today. We're going to talk about patient organizations and their role in civil society, helping improve policies, but also dealing with everyone else in the health system in order to achieve their missions. And a lot of that is on a volunteer basis. It's amazing the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Canadians who are involved in civil society and patients. We're going to hear from and talk about industry and the private sector and their role in participating in these conversations and collaborating with patient organizations. We'll understand where the alignment is and between and among the different health system stakeholders, especially patient organizations and industry. And I'm sure we'll get into how relationships may create real perceived or potential conflicts of interest. And I think there's a difference between creating a potential conflict of interest and addressing that interest, and then moving past that and actually having the conversation. So I think we'll get into that conversation throughout the webinar. So what are the considerations, challenges, and solutions that have been brought forward both in Canada and globally? And for that purpose, just thrilled to be able to introduce our panel today. Brian Huskins, coming to us from Toronto, is the Senior Fellow for Not-for-Profit Governance at the Institute on Governance. Brian has worked with organizations to ensure that stakeholders are engaged in the decisions that impact their lives, and he's got a long career in both public service and mainly working and representing civil society on consultations, including NGO representation at the global level, at the WHO, and with the United Nations General Assembly. Martine Elias, a good friend of mine and wearing different hats as well, has been a client in the past, is Director of Access, Advocacy, and Community Relations with Myeloma Canada. But Martine will draw on her background as an experienced pharmaceutical industry professional, but providing her perspectives on and the expectations of the challenges faced by patients and the groups that support them, especially with your most recent hat with Myeloma Canada, but really drawing on your background, having worked with patient organizations within the industry. Dr. Durhane Wong-Rieger needs no introduction probably to many people on the line. Is President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. The list is very long in terms of the number of Canadian and global boards, panels, and committees that she has been asked to serve on. And in addition to being immediate past chair of IAPO, the International Alliance of Patient Organizations, she has continued to help contribute to the international consensus framework for ethical collaboration. And so we're going to hear that framework language come up, and Durhane, really looking forward to learning how that came together at the global level and what lessons Canada is drawing to Canadianize some of those principles. which will lead us to our final panelist coming from Innovative Medicines Canada. Hugh Scott is Executive Director of Strategic Alliances with Innovative Medicines. And since 2008, Hugh has served in government relations functions, but right now is leading the association's outreach with partners within the life sciences and healthcare sectors at the national level. And he was joined by his colleague Rosy Sasso, who is Director of Ethics and Compliance at Innovative Medicines Canada. And Rosy has got a long and experienced career within the biopharmaceutical industry, especially in the area of compliance and privacy. And I think that's an excellent perspective that we can hear from today. How can these principles actually be applied within the private sector? So we're really fortunate to have not just people who will talk about how these things might work in principle and as frameworks, but actually how they can be applied and move into the culture within both civil society and within the private sector that wants to effectively and appropriately collaborate with patient organizations and other health system stakeholders. So with that, I would like to pass the microphone over, and I'm going to mute my mic over here and let Brian spend about 10 minutes with you to talk about governance considerations and really set the stage for today's panel. And please keep your questions coming, and there's a chat box on the bottom right. Write them down on the side. Looking forward to at least having 10 minutes, and we're going to hopefully get permission to go a bit over time because we got a bit of a late start. So over to you, Brian. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, William. Welcome. I want to talk about the Institute on Governance just for a second. We're a think tank based out of Ottawa. I work in the Toronto office. We focus on research, advisory services, and training to public sector, to Indigenous sector, and my area of focus is the not-for-profit sector. Within that, we do a lot of assessments with boards, structural realignment, strategic planning, and governance training with people. And one of the key pieces of the work we do, and if you go to the next slide here, Bill, it's just really working from a solid foundation of how we define governance. And for us, there's a four-part definition to governance at the Institute that we've, through our research and everything over the years. It's how you're accountable to stakeholders, how your decisions are made, who has the authority to make those decisions, and probably in this particular milieu, in terms of patient groups, who has a voice. And often, who has a voice in the accountability one runs, they run very close in sync to each other. But when we really want to define what governance is, there's a lot of stuff that we add in organizations around it, but really the core of what governance is as a board in an organization, and we focus on the board and the executive level of organizations, it is truly this. The nice part about this is it also applies within public governance as well. Much of our work that we do with provincial and federal government, we use this definition as well, because more and more as openness and transparency becomes the lay of the land with governance and public governance and governments. This is a great definition to fall back to. Within this, however, and I know that this is focusing a bit on conflict of interest, that's a whole workshop with the Institute on Governance. I wanted to talk about just potential areas of conflict, because I think often in patient groups, and in my experience over the last quarter century in those, there are some other potential areas. And if you could switch it, Bill. We often talk about the conflict of interest, which is sort of that perceived or actual conflict of interest and procedural interest and some of those things, but there's a whole other realm of interests that often get mixed into that, and when you're sitting around a table, it pushes people's buttons because we're dealing with passion and people who are, living with a disease, people who have survived a disease, people who have lost loved ones, so there's often a lot of emotion. The one that strikes most for me is sort of the potential conflict around values. And I'll tie this back into the governance piece of work that we do, but really the conflict around values is another area where conflict happens, and often it'll flow up and it'll be a conflict of interest, but when you go to the core, it may actually be based in values. And it's just people evaluate ideas, like the idea of accepting pharmaceutical dollars very differently based on their experience and other things, and their values. And organizations have values that they operate within, and so it's a very key part of all of this. There are also some structural areas of conflict where who makes the decision, in some organizations it's a board, and some it's a program manager, and in some it's an executive director. More and more we're seeing contracts with governments, for instance. I know we're talking about pharma, but it's sort of the piece of work within patient organizations. Governments are now having boards of directors sign off on all of those contracts. It's no longer an executive director, so therefore governance becomes even more important in terms of understanding what are the contractual obligations to the government or whoever is doing that. And I would think industry probably will follow and often has followed in some of those footsteps. There's the conflicts around relationship, and this is really around miscommunication. It could be between a committee of the board, it could be between program staff and the executive director, like all different places because of the strong emotions. And I actually fall guiltiest in this in my early days of being on not-for-profit boards, and that would be the repetitive negative behaviors, because I was sort of the activist at the board that had to yell and scream and everything else, and that was the way we did it 25 years ago. Today you don't do it that way because it's a very different environment, and you have to look at working in collaboratively. Whether we would be marching in the streets against a pharmaceutical company one day and taking money to do really good program work the next day, and it was often a very, very conflicting sort of a way to go, but we did it, and I think now we're seeing moves to be more transparent on that and more open, which is always great. And probably the last area of conflict would be in the area of data. The lack of information, misinformation, because it's it's like the game of telephone. One person tells a person who tells another person who tells another person, and before you know it, five down the line, you've got a total miscommunication. And that's where openness and being upfront about a lot of this will really, really benefits, because there's you cut down on the chance for that misinterpretation. Differing views on the data. Everybody can interpret data differently. We live in an era of evidence-based decision-making. Some would say that we've just gone through an era of decision-based evidence-making. So, we've moved on beyond that. So these are potential areas of conflict as organizations, as we look at these, to be aware of, because it allows us then, from my perspective and from a board level perspective, to look at these in advance and say, if we're going to be doing this work and if we're going to be working with XYZ company that provides this medication or medical device that is critical to our constituents, our patient group, our people, what do we have to have in place? So I will go quickly. I haven't kept track of my time very well, but I think I probably have about 3 or 4 minutes left. The next slide, I just want to talk really briefly about this. When we approach work on governance and the role of the board of directors, we break it down into 4 areas. One would be that foresight area, which is really around defining your priorities and objectives, the resource allocation, and things like that. And if you listen to the words that, when you're taking money from anybody, it impacts in this area. And if you're planning in advance, it also allows you to be very specific, and it allows less sway in terms of we have my, mission creep, let's say, or objective creep, or mandate, where it's sort of what you do, but not really, but it's such a good amount of money that you sort of say, we can do it. So, it's the strategic planning piece for boards. Certainly the generative insight type of things that we do, that's looking at your vision, your mission, and really critically within here are the values. And if you're starting to work more with pharmaceutical companies, it would be no different than if you're an environmental company working with oil. You would actually have to really quickly and very clearly define what those values are and what will allow you to work and where your parameters are around that. And that's actually the work of a board. It's not the work of staff. And so, that's another area. And again, each one of these is a workshop all on its own. So I'm just giving you the high-level overview of this. Oversight, which if you think of the traditional training you would take as a board member, fiduciary responsibilities, that was the big flag that everybody would wave. And often under fiduciary responsibilities is all about finances. But really this is also about the diligence, doing your homework and understanding what you're discussing when you come to the table. It's about loyalty, acting in the interest of the organization that you're on the board of directors of. You can't be on 2 boards in the same area of work and represent both 100%. So therefore, you have to, sometimes as an organization, make a decision and say you can only sit on 1 board. So really clearly putting boundaries on those fiduciary responsibilities. Gets tougher when you're getting into an area where there's fewer people or more rural or away where there's not as much population. You sometimes get the overlap. But having policies that can deal with that. And the big one on this would be risk management. When you're dealing with taking money from anybody, it's all about it can be about reputation. It can be about perception. It could be about the way people see you, those sorts of things. So it's really, really important from a board's perspective to have all of those policies in place and to be very clear on this. And I always put hindsight in here because for me, evaluation is the only way that you learn about what you've done wrong, what you've done right, and do corrective action. And really it's about monitoring the organizational performance and looking at the impact. If you're taking money from somebody and you're having no impact, you really need to be taking that money. So it's really putting that into the hands of the board and working to put the tools in place so that the organization that you're working with has some of that. So it's a bigger picture. It's more than conflict of interest, I guess is what I was trying to think to portray to you here, but also the concept that there is a definite role more and more every day for boards of directors within this work because it's critical. And I think I fell within my 10 minutes, hopefully.
Thanks very much, Brian. Over to you, Martine, and Myeloma Canada, Canada,
Thank you.
with the multiple hats that you've worn. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for being on the webinar this afternoon. If you want to go to the next slide, or should I? Okay, thank you. As you mentioned earlier, my background has been for most of my career in the pharmaceutical industry, working with patient organizations and developing policies for access to medication. And I've worked with many patient organizations in the past, and one of the things that maybe I omitted to look at or understand from their perspective is what were their principles in terms of working with industry. So I did a little bit of research online at some of the patient organizations that I knew, and I wasn't able to find anything published. They may have some. I know at Myeloma Canada we do not. We're a small organization, but that's something that we certainly are going to look into, is developing a set of principles when engaging with pharmaceutical companies. I know from my past experience that many actually abide by these principles, which are really, very important, but none of them are really sort of carved in stone or available in paper for distribution or for consumption by the pharmaceutical companies. So I was able to find on the International Alliance of Patient Organizations, they have some really strong patient principle by which they abide or look at when they're engaging with pharmaceutical companies. And they're fairly straightforward, and compliance is really important, making sure that they're abiding by the regulations and the laws and conduct of the different countries. Patient focus, obviously it makes sense that the interaction has to be beneficial to the patient. Mutual benefit is, really critical, both for the pharmaceutical company and also for the patient organization. There has to be somewhere a point of intersection in terms of where the goals are and where they meet. And respect, finally, is, probably one of the most important ones, because working with respect and understanding what the issues are and interacting in a transparent manner is really critical. So I thought that the principles that were offered by the IFO were very aligned with what I've seen from patient organizations, working with them in the past, but also from a Myeloma Canada perspective. So you want to switch the slide, please? So you want to go back one, please? So, there's obviously a lot of benefits in working with a pharmaceutical company from a patient's organization's perspective. Obviously, funding is really important because that's where we get a lot of their money. Resources, if it's either like material resources or people resources or strategic resource that can help us move our issues. Skill sharing is very important. Access to information, education material, scientific data is becoming more and more important as patient organizations are getting involved early in the development of real-world evidence platforms, and also working with pharmaceutical companies to develop clinical trial program and involved in some of the data. And understanding, the regulatory environment that we work in, how we get drugs getting approved, and from a safety and access perspective are really important. Information about pipeline is becoming more and more important because we've got involvement early in the clinical trial process. We have involvement in health technology assessments and evaluations. So it's important for us to understand, what those drugs are and be involved in the clinical trial program, either they're a plan or ongoing, because we're hearing more and more patients that want to learn more about those trials and want to be made aware of the options and the opportunities that they have to embark on those clinical trials, really important. Obviously, access to networks of contacts, information, access to key opinion leaders, really critical when we put together conferences. We do work with key opinion leaders to do some presentations, and we rely a lot on pharmaceutical companies to help us with identification or even with some costs associated with bringing these key opinion leaders. They do come and do some talks to their peers, and they're invited on professorship or some medical development opportunities, so we want to have access to those and bring them to our patients. Lobbying is really important, obviously from the pharmaceutical company, but also from the patient perspective, and quite often we're saying and wanting the same things. We may want it or say it in a different way, and working with industry certainly augments that voice and increases the opportunity to share our issues that are collective with some of the policy decision makers. Conferences obviously are really important, workshops, and also, obviously understanding the options that are available from different disease conditions or managing health conditions are really important. So if you want to switch to the next one, Bill, pharmaceutical companies' principles, they're very much aligned. So obviously, they want to interact with patient groups in an ethical and compliant and transparent manner. They really are looking to us to help them with access issue and not to specifically focus on an appropriate or a specific drug. So really, the approach is really from a non-promotional perspective. It's more around disease awareness and the need for options for therapies. Credible, relevant policy and access information on a timely basis is something that they're very much in line to doing, and collaborating with advocacy partners is also very important. And looking to develop long-term relationships is really something that's important. We've seen pharmaceutical companies that come in a therapeutic area, they call upon a patient organization, the drug is approved, then it goes generic, and then all of a sudden that relationship sort of falters or comes to a close. I'm seeing a lot more companies that are looking at a long-term vision and engaging with patient organizations on policy issues that obviously, transgress or are longer in terms of just the access to a particular drug. And there are a number of guidelines and principles that have been published. I listed here the EU, US and Canada. The industry association all have guidelines on how they want to engage with patient organizations. So you can see there's a lot of links and collaterals between the two. So which is really important sort of moving forward. So if you want to switch, maybe I do have access.
Oh, switch.
Didn't switch.
Next slide.
Next slide, please. Thank you. And pharmaceutical companies do have criteria for engaging with patient organizations, which I think are important for patient groups to understand. Obviously the first thing makes sense. They have to be willing to partner with companies. Some patient organizations may not see the benefits, and that's okay. I mean, they may be from the governance perspective and maybe some of the strategic direction, but pharma companies want to work with patient organizations that are willing to work with them. They have to have an ability to sustain a relationship over time. The scope of activity is really important. So are they focused more on disease awareness, advocacy? Can they do patient submissions? Are all questions that pharmaceutical companies will ask. Are they able to influence, and do they have access to influencers and decision makers is something that's really important. Are they involved in shaping policies down the road? Is that something that they're, are they looking for the today or for down to the future? Responsiveness and timeliness is also an important criteria, and they have to have a proven record in terms of being committed to patient access, because obviously that's something that's the most of importance for a pharmaceutical company, and that's what they're looking for in engaging with patient organizations. Are they recognized by some of the health authorities, CADIS? Do they have a relationship with them? Do they have, what's their reach and their breadth? Are they media appropriate? If there's an issue that arises on a particular issue, drug or therapeutic area, are they able to provide a balanced face or comments to the media? Not to say that, they have to be aligned with what the pharmaceutical company says, but are they going to be sort of balanced in their approach? And the size of organization doesn't really matter. It's really, they're really looking at the potential of this organization, and if they have the ability to deliver on all the previous comments that I've made. Can you go to the next, please? So a lot of times the question is, how do you engage with a pharmaceutical company? So there's two different ways that pharmaceutical companies look at working with patient organizations. And I've kind of categorized, there may be more than this, but these are the most important ones. There's charitable contribution or program sponsorships. So the charitable contribution, I call that, it's like, money for general programs is kind of it's a donation, basically. It's like the pharmaceutical company will give a donation to the patient organization, no strings attached, and the patient organization can do, pretty much what they've requested the money for, and there's no accountability on the end of the pharmaceutical company or the patient organization to follow up. Obviously, each pharmaceutical companies have sets of criteria by which they are going to provide the money. It has to be for a bona fide, event or an opportunity that is very much, it's a giving program, as opposed to giving money for sponsorship or for programs. So from the patient organization's perspective, maybe charitable organization is more important or is more desirable. But from the pharmaceutical company, they would prefer sponsorship program because the money is more directive. It's to provide support for a particular program. The funds usually cannot be transferred, and there's an accountability that sort of stems from giving sponsorship money. So really quickly, one of the areas where we see a lot of interaction between pharma company and patient organization that's a lot more specific in terms of what the ask is, and that is for health technology submission, where there's a new product that comes onto the market in Canada, and the HTA body offers the patient organization the opportunity to do a patient submission, which they do, and obviously it's much of interest to the pharmaceutical company. So how do you work in that kind of relationship? Because it's very specific to a particular drug. So, I believe, and this is what Myeloma Canada espouses, that a pharmaceutical company's role is around education and making sure that the patient organization is aware of the process and that they're engaged. Pharmaceutical company actually has to can help facilitate the process, making sure that the patient organization has information about the particular drug, and that they have a good relationship with the HTA bodies that are reviewing these drugs. And transparency, it has to be hands-off. The pharmaceutical company cannot engage or direct or put some demands on the patient organization to focus on a certain aspects or not focus on another aspect, because really the pharmaceutical company that do this right will shine by letting the process play out. Last slide really is, there's a lot of common issues between pharmaceutical companies and patient organization. And I've listed just a few here where there's a lot of intersection that is not necessarily about the drug, because a lot of times, patient groups or the public may not be sort of understanding that the needs of the pharmaceutical company are not just about their particular drug, but about shaping the environment in which they operate. And they're very similar from the patient organizations as well. So there's lots of different ways that patient organization can work on these particular issues with the pharmaceutical company. And I guess my last slide is the players that we're not all in bed, but it's not as bad as they look on this slide, but companies and patient regulatory and work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martine. And I would like to, especially the overlap in terms of interests, and for sharing the cartoon. Okay, over to Durhane, global and some of your experience with IAPO, and you always come back from a trip with a few amazing nuggets, so I'm expecting them to all be consolidated now. Durhane.
Thank you so very much, and I, number one, really appreciate the opportunity of presenting with the people that are on this panel. An amazing learning always, and was really great to reconnect. I've known both Brian and Martine in a variety of roles, so now here we come back. So happy to talk about sort of the patient journey specifically with regard to partnership. I'm going to start, if you take to the first slide, a little bit of where I'm starting from. I think really a great opportunity to speak on behalf of the International Alliance of Patient Organizations, but I think like Brian, I think we're very much, influenced by our own history in terms of patient engagement. And Brian and I were just comparing the fact that we've been, patient advocates, fellow patient advocates for more than 25 years. So this is interesting. I just wanted to put this up because Brian was talking about kind of how patients participate now. But I think quite frankly, this whole transition still exists. And as at IAPO, the International Alliance of Patient Organizations, we are a global network of about 270 patient groups that range from very, very large groups in very developed areas of both disease areas and sophistication of the groups like the International Diabetes Federation to, in fact, very, very small, still, kitchen tabletop, mom and pop organizations. They still have to be registered organizations, but may often represent a new and emerging area in Africa and Latin America and Asia, where they're both their own resources and capacity in patient partnerships are quite new, but also where the environment, I think, is at a very different stage than many of us in the Western area. And so I think a bit of what Brian was saying before, and I just did it a bit in a graphic, I think certainly when, I think back to when we first began, it was really very much this whole notion of barbarians at the gates. Nobody was letting us into the room. We would oftentimes, be shouting and screaming and creating demonstrations and creating all kinds of mayhem just to get into the door because nobody was listening. And when you see this picture, this is actually from Hong Kong recently, right? You remember the umbrella campaign. So there are countries still where this is really very much what they're doing, and really the goal is I just have to get your attention and to count because I'm not getting it. What happens, I always say, is that if you make enough fuss, you get to come into the door. They open up the door, but usually they only open up the door crack, right? And they shove in a few people. And we become what I call beggars at the table, or, because really at that point, you're there, but they're just barely tolerating you, and they barely, and you, of course, don't know a whole lot. It is a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, and I mean, and quite frankly, I think the graphic's a little bit apt, because I do think the communities you're coming to a little bit like the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Let's be clear, there's not like really good rules happening there, but you're often there, and you're trying to understand, and as Brian says, we said earlier, if we knew now what we knew then, we probably would have behaved a bit differently. So you're still there, you're trying to establish a position, and again, in many developing countries, of course, just getting to that table and now feeling that way is very much the case. So the partnership's not equal. We've got big differences in terms of power, in terms of influence, and certainly, as Martine's talking about, big difference in terms of resources. What happens over time, though, is, as Martine says, you get to the point where, okay, you need me, I need you, I've got something to provide to you, you've got something to provide to me. We're not necessarily partners, but we're kind of what I call strange bedfellows, right? It's that whole notion of we need to kind of trade off a bit. We don't necessarily, I think as Brian says, necessarily share the same values. We may have same objectives, and that is to get a change in the system. In terms of coming from the pharmaceutical side, is helping to develop patient advocates so that we can, in fact, be value partners and be value added and be comfortable in terms of contributing to development of policies, etc. And the last slide, I think, is where a lot of people fear we might be going, and that is, where the inmates are going to be taking over the asylum. As I always say, given how the asylums are run in most cases, I don't think the inmates could do a much worse job of it. So there we be. We're probably not looking for that, but I think that's the fear that kind of keeps things from transitioning further. Next slide, please. This is just very quickly, and it reiterates a lot of what Brian had said, in terms of the organizations and where Martina said in terms of partnering, and that is from a patient group point of view. patient groups, in my mind, invariably go through a same trajectory in terms of development. And I see it now as we're working with groups in Asia, Africa, Latin America, but also new groups and emerging, certainly in the rare disease space, and where I think that we've all been, and that is most groups start at that bottom right-hand corner, where they're really driven by the service to their members. And where I oftentimes get groups that say, we don't want to take pharma funding because we don't want to be biased by them. And here, you're still a small group. You're still able to meet your needs with voluntary donations and with volunteers. What happens over time is that I say the crisis is when you're actually really good and the needs that you're trying to fill exceed your capacities to fill them, and you've got a bigger mission. Many of them transition to what I call B, the entrepreneurial growth, what Brian and was talking. We can partner as patients, as individuals. Individual testimony is Martine's talking about at HTA. Those is really still important. Patient groups, though, are needed in order to have that bigger impact, to be able to provide the breadth of to back into the organizations as a consultant sitting inside the group. And then where we, on the top right-hand corner, I think is where it's really important, is where you actually get to be a patient representative with sort of equal rights and says at whatever they're taking development. At the end of the day, all four of these roles still remain. You never can get away from the importance of the individual patients or what that patient group is doing on the ground. So it's trying to make sure, and as an organization, so figure out which one are you, or number two, how do I, next please, which gets us to, next slide, and as we all know, transparency of what Brian conduct, I'm saying we need to put it out there so everybody can see it, but we to each other be accountable. Next, and what partner that's like.
In order to be members. And essentially what this document does is it governs everything that we do, all our member employees and with whomever stakeholder. And stakeholder may be anything from healthcare professionals to government to patient groups, of course. And I think what's key to this document is the overall objective is to promote our reputation and to ensure that there's trust. And now I like to pull some of the common themes that we've heard through the other panelists, and this notion of trust is very important, and we need to be able to trust that both parties are acting in an ethical fashion. And so as we go through the actual code, and I invite you all to go visit the code and have a look through it, but you'll see that member companies are bound by these overall guiding principles and in some instances quite prescriptive requirements when we're dealing with third parties and stakeholders. There's a section at the very end of the code that speaks to our transparency guidelines, whereby we ask our member companies to behave in a fashion where first and foremost the patient comes first. And that is our first guiding principle for the entire code, and then it also comes through in these transparency guidelines. And where we are cognizant, however, of the potential or perceived conflicts of interest, we encourage our member companies to make sure that all our interactions are documented well, and we have requirements around the funding that's provided. And I think, we heard some of that already from Martine's perspective and Durhane's perspective as well, both from the requesting perspective as well as the granting perspective. So, and all this is in the spirit of making sure that we have and maintain ethical interactions, maintaining the respect and trust between both parties. Another initiative that Innovative Medicines Canada has recently embarked on is in regards to payment disclosure. So with payment disclosure, we all have heard in the media how that our colleagues, for example, in the U.S. have mandated a payment disclosure in the form of what they call the Sunshine Act. And this is quite prominent not only in the U.S. but also in the European countries, Australia, Japan. And so as we are keeping our fingers on the pulse of the environment internationally, we as a Canadian entity decided, well, we need to be on top of this and make sure that our member companies are prepared. And so with that came a payment disclosure framework. At the given time, it's a voluntary framework based on, aggregate reporting of member payments to physicians and healthcare organizations. We also know, and you might have seen in the media, that 10 member companies have decided to move forth and adopt this framework, and they will be disclosing as quickly as 2017. So again, I invite you to look through the code, because you'll see there are many requirements that we as member companies must abide by when interacting with the patient groups and considering funding requests or requests for in-kind related donations, such as expertise and time. And so with that, I'll pass it back to you, Bill.
Thanks so much, Rosy and Hugh, and to all the panelists. We're bumping right up against 2 o'clock. However, I did get a green light to take us over the 1 hour mark, considering we started a bit late. So I don't want to waste any more time, because we've got one question. Thank you, Peter, for your question. What is the perspective of provincial ministries of health? Aren't they suspicious of the links between pharmas and patient groups? And I don't know who wants to take that one, but in fact that was one of the reasons why we thought that this would be a timely and good webinar to do. Does anyone want to talk about that? There's no provincial health ministry actually on the line, but maybe that's another opportunity to bring this out further and get them involved and actually hear about any concerns that they might have. Anyone else in Toronto have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Probably Durhane.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of, this is again why I said we developed the code to begin with, because we find that we do get fingers pointed at us, and quite frankly, it's never pointed at us in terms of what we actually do. And I oftentimes say, never mind who is partnering or helping support this, if you can point to what I'm doing that is in fact, unethical or biased or not a true patient opinion, then let me know, because that would be something I need to correct. And quite frankly, nobody ever comes back. It is in many cases, and we hate to kind of just put it that way, it becomes a convenient way of discounting what you're saying or your presence. And I think that's something that we continually push back. I will say is that for many of us that has become less and less, because I think number one, we do work and we present ourselves in a way that is in fact true to the patient and to our ethical principles. And two, I think we have also, I push back by basically saying, we do partner with Pharma and we do get resources from Pharma. I oftentimes joke about the fact I put up my conflict of interest slides, and here's all the groups that I have a potential conflict because they help support me. And then I put up my slide that says, here's groups I have no conflict of interest with. Health Canada, the provincial governments, CADA, these are all the groups that I do a tremendous amount of work for, and I get nothing from them. This is something wrong with this. I should have a conflict of interest with you. So, we need to have more equal funding. I'd be happy to take your money.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to, just from a governance perspective, I think traditionally, and everything's a governance issue sometimes for me, boards weren't allowed to really necessarily say where they were getting their money and from where, sometimes to their provincial funders. Or like there's sort of been this veil over a lot of that, and I think that as we see these things changing, boards of directors in terms of part of their accountability and transparency, and of course governments are doing that as well. I think just saying, I got X number of dollars from here for this, whereas before there's always been a bit of a mystery about that, and I think that's maybe where some of the push-pull came with provincial governments or ministries of health, because they said, if we're giving you $100,000 and X is giving you 20, what are you doing for them that you're not doing, like that sort of a thing. So I think that the transparency piece probably will, if there have ever been issues, will maybe raise that up a little bit. And again, you need to have all of the frameworks in place to make sure that that happens in a constructive way.
Thanks very much. Okay, you know what? We don't have any more questions. Is there any other insights that the panel wants to react to from either what's happening internationally or in Canada, recognizing that we are a bit over time? Any final thoughts from the panel? Maybe is this to be continued in terms of a conversation?
I think it is to be continued. I think the fact that we've seen the patient, what I call the patient movement in Canada over the last few years, culminate in a, I'll use the Canadian consensus framework as an example, into a Canadian implementation of this international effort to develop ethical guidelines for collaboration. I mean, the work on that is going to take a long time to normalize into the thinking of government officials. across the country, but the fact that we're come together to formalize our relationships as industry and as patient organizations and healthcare professionals, I think that's a tremendous step, and there's a long road to go here, Bill. I think everybody knows that, but we're in a good place, and we're moving forward, and that's what we can all do is work together to ensure that we're all very open and ethical about our behaviors and about our relationships with one another.
Thanks very much. And Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Durhane had said, and I think it's really important, and you can't reiterate it enough, and that is around ethical standards. And sort of when you're talking about some of these things, we're talking about a cultural shift within organizations and the way they work and the way they think sometimes. Not just on this issue, on many, but I like, and I really loved actually what you said, Durhane, when you said, you can sign on, and if you aren't doing anything, it means nothing. And I just have to say that I've seen this over and over with so many sort of broad policies, whether it be around gender equality, whether it be around stereotype or whatever, where these great policies and these great things come out there, and we pull them in and we throw them into the operations management structure of an organization, and human resources takes care of something, but then it doesn't really go anywhere other than it's on paper. And that's where I really sort of thump my little governance Bible and say, these changes have to be integrated at the governance level with boards of directors, and they have to really understand their role in this. If you don't do that, you're not going to get the cultural shift, and you're going to sign on to something that really means nothing in the end. And I think we have to go for the richness of that and make things happen. And so thanks for bringing that up, Durhane, because it really pushed that button for me, because that's sort of one of the goals we have at the Institute on Governance in terms of working with boards, is to get them to step up to some of these issues and take them on and own them and make it happen. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Brian. And honestly, to all the panelists, we've got one more question that came in from Anthony regarding insight on the relationship between pharma and patient groups over social media specifically. Anthony, I'd invite you to just send that question in to us, because we're running up against the clock and some people have to run. It's a good one, and hopefully we can find a few links and some ideas. And I think honestly, questions like that could actually go on to social media for a debate or webinars like this. And Brian, you were mentioning that the IOG has access to workshops on each of the ways that a board can actually build itself those policies that can develop the trust. Rosy, you did a great job of walking through how and why and where the Code of Ethics is being expanded and being used right now, but really taking on this issue around transparency with patient groups. Martine, having worn different hats on this relationship, but now representing an important cancer stakeholder for the Cancer Survivor Network, we can't thank you enough for providing your insights here. And Durhane, thanks for taking us out of Canada and bringing back the fact that this is happening around the world. And I think it's a good question. How can Canada actually lead and do right by patients and health system and stakeholders and citizens in order to actually have a better health system that's sustainable for the long run? So I'd like to thank everyone who came on the line. The answer is yes. This presentation will be available on YouTube, and we'll get back to the Survivor Network if we can actually circulate a PDF version of all of the slides. We'll let you know. Jody, thank you for that question. Anthony, please email us. We'll talk about social media again. And really thank you everyone in Toronto and my friends here in Ottawa for being online. To be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's retarded.
Yeah, this makes me nervous now.
I think we need to mute people. We'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our expert panelists for today, taking the time to provide us with such really interesting and very useful information. The webinar will be available online tomorrow. There'll be a full video on YouTube as well as slides, which will be on our SlideShare account. You'll find the link to all of these on our front page of our website from tomorrow, and everyone who's registered will be sent the links to all of that information. So yes, you will have access to everything very shortly. Thank you all.